Hello you guys, what is going on? There's a ton of information around crafting, and spending over 100 hours in the game so far, I've came up with a list of 5 major mistakes you could be making when you're crafting in Last Epoch. If you want to know how to make the best gear in Last Epoch and master crafting, if you watch this video to the end, you will know basically everything there is to know and how to make gear like this or this and some of the best gear in the entire game. That being said, let's get right into it. There are timestamps in the video, but I do want to go over all the basics very quickly since this is a comprehensive guide. Now, the first big thing for crafting in Last Epoch is you have to have forging potential. If you have 0, you can't craft on the item. If you have any forging potential left, each upgrading of an affix costs forging potential. Once it hits 0, crafting on that weapon is done. Essentially, an exalted weapon means that it has a tier 6 or tier 7 affix on it. Now, the first big mistake when it comes to crafting in Last Epoch is not understanding the differences between your prefixes and your suffixes when crafting. There is a very specific pool of affixes for prefixes and one also for suffixes. And when I say that, that means, for instance, things like chance to shock on hit. Since it's a suffix, cannot go on an item as a prefix. So it's good to keep in mind, especially the main priority affixes you're going to be going for on your build, which ones are suffixes and which are prefixes. This means that in order to replace it with something else, if you do want to have the chance of replacing it for something better, you need to make sure you check your crafting materials, and then you can sort that by prefixes, as you can see right here. You can then scroll through these prefixes to get an idea which ones could actually go on this weapon, so you can get an idea of whether or not you do want to swap out your current affix or modifier for a specific one, because again, prefixes and suffixes are completely separate. By upgrading either of them, you can only get one of these effects that's in that same pool. You can also do the same for suffixes. You can see a list of suffixes here that are going to be different than those prefixes. Now, the second mistake I've seen is not using your glyphs properly, and that being primarily 3 glyphs in particular. So if we use this scepter, for instance, let's say we have an affix on the scepter that you're specifically hunting because it's a rare affix, or you just need the shards to save them for later. Let's say we want the 31% increased damage affix. That would be this physical damage affix right here. Now, in order to save this, you could use your Rune of Shattering, obviously, and it's going to give you shards essentially for all of these on the weapon. Now, a lot of people continue to use these even on rare. A rare affix, as an example, would be one that you normally can't find, or it's a lot harder to find on gear. A good example of these would be double stat affixes like the +5 to minion melee damage and bow damage. There are stats like this that exist for a lot of different builds and stat lines in the game. You can see we currently only have 3 shards for that. So if we used our Rune of Shattering, we would get a random amount of shards for every single thing here. Since it's a tier 2, the max amount of shards we could get is 2. And the least amount of shards we could get is 0 by using the Rune of Shattering. Because it's random, you get a random amount from 0 to the level tier it is, which would be 2. Now, here where some of the tricks come in that you may not have used yet. So instead, if we were to swap this out with Rune of Removal, what that would do is give us the maximum amount of shards for each one of these affixes based on the highest tier it is. So for here, we would get 2 shards. We would get 6 shards for melee attack speed, etc. But it chooses one random one at a time, and this does require forging potential. So make sure when you find rare affixes, you're using your Rune of Removal and not the Rune of Shattering, because otherwise you'll end up a lot of times getting a lot less shards for those rare affixes. Next is paying attention to your max rolls. So ideally there is a roll range on certain affixes or stats. For an example, this gives us 31% increased physical damage. There's a roll range between, let's say, 30 and 40%, just give or take, for this actual affix and what it rolls. So what happens is when you upgrade this affix, it will actually re-roll within the new tier range, which in this case, if we upgraded it, would re-roll in the tier 3 tier range. Now, what the Glyph of Order lets you do is when you have a high roll on an item or an affix that you're looking to upgrade, let's say it's the max roll possible. Let's say this 31% was 40%. It was the maximum possible roll. You could use the Glyph of Order here when actually upgrading it. So we're going to remove this rune. And then once we go to upgrade this thing, it shows us it's going to upgrade us to 46%. And it allows you to keep that actual roll range at the maximum roll range that you have on the affix already. Next is upgrading your gear and paying attention to your roll ranges so you get the most powerful gear possible. And now you're going to ask, like in Diablo 4, if you could change a setting to see your roll ranges, that would be easy, right? One thing a lot of people I see aren't using are using your alt key. Your alt key gives you the ability to see the roll range on each affix individually. And if you don't use this right now or didn't know this, drop a like on the video, because I'm telling you right now, a lot of you I know aren't doing this. And you can again see that roll range right there before you decide to upgrade it, so you can see whether you got a good roll or not. So like I said, here for tier 3, if we got that range of 53%, which would be the maximum roll, we could use our Glyph of Order to keep that high roll. So currently we're at 46, kind of right in the middle. You can see if we upgrade this to 62%, it then again stays right in the middle, right where that roll range exactly was. But if we actually take this away and just use our Glyph of Hope here to upgrade this, and we upgrade it, you can see now we're at 87. We're still right in the middle. But if you don't use a Glyph of Order, again, your roll is going to be random, and it's just going to depend. And it's not going to show you what the percent's going to go to. It's just going to roll it in the new range. So that's something to keep in mind, especially if you're upgrading a very important affix on your piece of gear. Now, another mistake and big tip I can give for you is using your Glyphs of Despair. Now, at the beginning, even when I had a high level character, I wasn't using these, but I'm telling you, you can use these to craft really powerful gear if you do it right. Now I have 5 stats here specifically I all want for my build. If you notice, this weapon is an exalted weapon, but I do have 5 stats on it, one being my high tier exalted affix. And the way I actually did this was using, again, a Glyph of Despair. So how the Glyph of Despair works is you can use this on an affix that is below tier level 5. And there are 2 things that happens when you use one of these. The affix will get upgraded 1 tier, for example, from tier 3 to tier 4. And there's a chance that you can seal that affix on your piece of gear. Meaning if you're successful and it does seal it, like you can see down here, it goes on the weapon permanently and opens up another slot for you to add any affix that you want. And you could pick any one you want onto the actual piece itself. By doing this, you can go from having 4 affixes on your gear to having 5 affixes on your gear, all that you actually want, making even more powerful weapons. Another trick is you can actually use the Glyph of Despair to put the specific affix you want on a piece of gear. That's right, you don't actually have to randomly roll this dodge rating affix to hope to get some sort of suffix that you want. You can actually use this glyph to put the exact thing you want on the weapon. Let's say these 3 affixes right here are the ones we wanted. Let's say this tier 3 dodge rating affix, we don't want it all. So normally what some people would do would come in here, Glyph of Chaos, and they would roll this dodge rating affix to a random affix and just pray that they got the one that they wanted. Now what you should be doing, especially if all of these other affixes are pretty much upgraded, is you can use a Glyph of Despair. Now again, this works the same way. Keep in mind, tier 1 affixes have a much higher chance to seal, tier 2 affixes have a lesser chance to seal, etc. The higher tier the affixes, the harder it is to seal. But ideally, if we can seal this, that would open up a spot for us to actually pick exactly what affix we want. So you don't have to use the Glyph of Chaos here. You can use the Glyph of Despair to seal it, to put the exact thing you want on your piece of gear. Just as an example, whether or not this fails, we'll try it. We're going to upgrade that affix, and you can see we sealed it right here. So again, we only used 1 Glyph of Despair, a little bit of forging potential, and now we can select exactly what affix we want, and we can pick through this entire list. And if you're wondering, this Glyph of Insight right here works with an experimental affix. It's garbage. I don't think you're ever going to need to use it. Enough said. Now, another thing people really don't pay attention to when they're rolling their gear or trying to upgrade it is using other runes that actually affect some of the affixes or implicits on the gear. So you can see, for instance, this belt, the implicit effects are the effects at the top. That's going to be that plus 28 mana and that plus 3 potion slots. Now you can see here there is a roll range for those implicits, just like there are affixes. Now each piece of gear generally has certain implicits that it has on it, but the roll ranges can actually be affected. So let's say this was our best belt, but it had 16 mana instead of the maximum 32 or 28 like it currently has. What we can do is actually use a Rune of Shaping, and we can re-roll those implicits so that way we can try and get the max roll. Even though that would kind of be dumb to do right now, we're going to roll it, and it's going to go from 28 mana from once we shape it to now having 23 mana. So obviously we went down in that case. But if you have a lower roll on any of these specific stats, or even a weapon like my staff where there's a bunch of individual stats on it, you can re-roll these implicits until you get good ones. Now your Rune of Discovery, not necessarily super great, but if you want to build out the perfect weapon, this is kind of a waste of time. And then Rune of Refinement, again, like the implicits, you can use this to re-roll the values of all affixes on an item within their tiers. So if we have this belt and all of our rolls are basically trash, we can use the Rune of Refinement to re-roll the value of all of those affixes within their tiers in case you want to re-roll them because they're all absolute garbage. And again, a big thing to keep in mind here is this tier 6 affix for increased chance to find potions is 78%. The roll range for that is 75 to 99%. And this is our exalted affix, which is our big one that we really need the most. And there's nothing you can do to that because it's past a tier 5, right? So in this case, that's actually wrong. The Rune of Refinement works on all of these regardless of their tiers, meaning our high tier affix, we can use this on to actually fix it if it's a trash roll. This is one you don't need to use that often, but when you do need to use it, it can save a weapon or piece of armor very easily. And now your Rune of Ascendance. Your Rune of Ascendance obviously turns any piece of gear, if it's let's say a belt, any rarity belt, into a unique item of that same type. So using this would turn this belt into a unique belt. If we ascended this, we would now get the Ward Trail belt. One of the last things to keep in mind for runes is one you probably may have not seen yet. And that is going to be this one right here that I have 0 in, and that is the Rune of Creation. Now what that does is once you have an item fully specced out exactly the way you want it, like you have an item like let's say this ring and it happens to still have forging potential, but you've upgraded everything on it, or it's just a good ring in general. What that rune actually does is duplicates this item, but both items now have 0 forging potential, meaning you can't craft on them anymore whatsoever. Ideally, this doesn't matter that much for pieces of gear, unless you just want to dupe a piece of gear because there's forging potential left and it's good, so you can give it to a friend or whatever. But what this is really good for is rings. Specifically, let's say I had this ring and it still had forging potential, and this was the best ring that I had by far, perfect rolls and everything. But I have another ring that's different that's kind of okay. You can use that Rune of Creation to pull that ring in, as long as it still has forging potential, duplicate it, and now you have 2 rings, the exact same thing. You have 2 god roll rings, and now your character is about to just be extremely OP, so keep that in mind. And lastly, because the game's so new for a lot of people, I still see a lot of people misunderstanding how to properly use the Eternity Cache. So the Eternity Cache is located at the end of a couple of different dungeons. Now what the Eternity Cache lets you do is put in a legendary item and an exalted item with exactly 4 affixes. What happens is once you come back and it gets crafted, the legendary gear will take a certain amount of affixes from the exalted piece of gear depending on how much legendary potential it has. For example, this two-handed axe has 1 legendary potential, so you have to put it in there with an exalted two-handed axe with 4 affixes on it. Since this has 1 legendary potential, what that means is it will consume the new two-handed exalted axe and pick 1 random affix off of it and put it on this unique piece of gear, and that will then create this new legendary piece of gear with the added 1 affix. Now if you find a unique with 2 legendary potential, and you can do this for up to 4 legendary potential on a piece of gear is still very rare, but if you happen to find one with 4 as an example, and you craft it with the exalted weapon and the Eternity Cache, it will now get all 4 affixes from that exalted piece of gear that you have. So keep that in mind. If you find an item with higher legendary potential, make sure to save it because it's very valuable and very rare. If you enjoyed, like the video, subscribe if you're new, and make sure to check out either of these 2 Last Epoch videos, and I will see you guys in the next one. Peace.